autumn of 1956 was bleak, with conflict in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. This was the time when Soviet tanks rolled into Hungary to crush a short-lived revolution, and when Britain and France attacked Egypt to try to seize the Suez Canal. Both of these crises developed from a long chain of events, and there was a kind of fateful feeling about the daily news. Just a few weeks before these events, a new novel was published whose tone fitted the mood of the time. It was called The Dark of Summer, and set in Shetland and Faroe, with Orkney scenes too. And its author, Eric Linklater, knew all three island groups well. His father, a sea captain, had come from a farming family in Harry in the heart of Orkney. And his own feeling for the islands and their landscape and people had been expressed in numerous books, right from his first novel, Whitemouth Saga, in 1929. There was a kind of polarity in his life between Orkney and the world beyond, which comes through in characters of some of his stories. Sometimes they settle back with a feeling of deep contentment in island life, and sometimes they find themselves carried by events to journeys at sea or adventures in a far land. His own life had been shaped by events through 2 world wars. He was just 17 when he volunteered for the army in the First World War, and he survived 2 hard years in the trenches and a bullet through his helmet. In World War II, his writing skills were called on, describing life on various fronts. He saw much action at first hand. He recorded the long, hard advance through Italy. One of his first wartime assignments was to write a book in 1941 about the forces defending the northern outposts in Shetland, Orkney, Iceland, Faroe. It was published as The Northern Garrisons, with a depth of understanding for the soldiers and the communities. And in a post-war world, old memories were stirred by a call in 1951 to go to Korea as an official observer of the British and Commonwealth troops serving there. When he returned home, he was back into writing, this time going back in the past to the Norse era in Orkney. By the summer of 1955, his book, The Ultimate Viking, was complete. He took a break, enjoying fishing and meeting friends, and in that relaxed state found that thoughts were coming back about his wartime journey north in 1941. Those thoughts began to shape themselves into a new novel. But, like a difficult fish, it began to resist and challenge him, as he said indeed in a letter to his friend and publisher, Rupert Hart Davis.
I'm in the middle of a horribly difficult book. Wading breast high against a strong current on a rocky and treacherous bottom, and although there are fish in the water, they're damned sullen and slow to move. What a ridiculous life one leads. Shall we give it up and do a Gauguin? Sell your business for what it will fetch? We'll go to Tahiti or some such place. Tell your secretary to get a shipping list.
But he kept at it. This was a strange year in the world, with some patterns persisting from the past, and yet among them new hopes for the future in the post-war landscape. On the darker side, it was the year when North and South Vietnam went to war, and when the first intercontinental ballistic missile was launched. But it was also the year of renewed sovereignty for West Germany and Austria after years of occupation, and for finalised peace between Burma and Japan. It was a time of change, with Winston Churchill's retirement as Prime Minister, And it was the year when black people began to campaign for their rights in the American South with a boycott of segregated buses. Eric Linklater was very conscious of the unsettled times, and when he was invited to give an address at Leeds School of Medicine, he spoke of the Prometheus legend to illustrate the challenges that were coming from the advancement of science. He described how Prometheus had stolen fire, with so much benefit for humans and their arts and crafts. But fire, he noted, was a mixed blessing.
So we, who are about to enjoy the increasing power and comfort of our Promethean age, enter our inheritance with a feeling of guilt, a sensation of fear, because fire in untaught hands can easily consume those hands and all their neighbours.
And into the dark of summer he wove together all these threads of human darkness and light and deep brooding guilt from the past, and the fatefulness of half a century of war. He wove in the islands in the north, and particularly Faroe with its high dark cliffs and its warm and brightly coloured houses. And running through the whole story is the nature of time and the way in which the past seems to entangle us in its flow. The book starts with a feeling that there is something hanging over its narrator, Tony Chisholm, former soldier like Eric Linklater, and like him, someone who looks below the surface of things. He looks at times from a position between two worlds, in between our day-to-day existence and some other world where darkness and light coexist, seen in the light of midsummer in Shetland.
Where shall I live when I retire? Where I'm living now, on leave from the great watershed, there is, at the top of summer, no darkness at midnight. The day puts on a veil, the light is screened, and a landscape that in fine weather appears at noon to be almost infinite, in which long roads and little houses are luminously drawn, becomes small and circumscribed, and the hills and the shore, the sheep in the fields and the glinting sea are visible, as it were, through a pane of slightly obscuring glass. The landscape becomes an image of the world in which we live. It is not dark, but nothing can be seen as plainly and decisively as the light of noon pretends. Noon flatters and deludes us. Yet all that can be seen is solid, solid enough for faith. And if one's heart is whole, one can enjoy the beauty inherent in our mystery, a beauty that is, paradoxically, more visible in half-light.
This time of year, a stillness in the turning seasons, when a doorway can seem to open between the worlds, is the setting for the discovery of a body in a Shetland peat moss. And that takes Tony Chisholm's mind back to a wartime investigation into suspected treachery, and a journey from Scapa Flow to Faroe to seek the truth on a trawler in naval service. On the way back to Scotland, the ship encounters a storm of almost apocalyptic power, and the trawler seems to be locked into a slow flow of time as it rises up into each wave and sinks back again.
Now the gale was at its height, but the movement of the sea was still increasing. It was no longer merely very rough. It became a huge and vehement, an abysmal violence on which roughness supervened. Now the movement came from great depths that had been slow to answer the gale's demand, but now, as it seemed, were rolling in a cosmic tide, from whose gigantic billows, rising dark and high above the bridge, the storm tore a continuous spray, and in whose sickening troughs an undertow or contrary swell often laid us low upon our side. Into these deep valleys of the sea the trawler sank and shuddered, then with its bow pointing to the sky, and the gun on its forward deck aiming at high clouds, it climbed to mountainous and tattered crests that filled its main deck with white water, and with a roll and a twist rushed down again, out of the wind, but into the rearing menace of the next great wave. Time lost its ordinary measure. Time was measured only by the black hills we must climb, the monstrous valleys into which we swooped. There was no sun, but for a little while a half-transparent cloud let through a meagre light that silvered and the ragged tops of impending waves, and scored more deeply in the wind-cut runes in the sucking, swirling hollows beneath. Ridge after broken ridge, in endless procession, the howling of the gale, the deck vanishing under a cascade of water, and the little ship with its little company of men tumbling madly, groaning and protesting, but holding its course and fighting stubbornly, mile after mile, towards the south.
You can feel time slowing down and the narrator trapped within it. These early stages of the book bring out a picture of time that is an old one. It's an image of a flow carrying us along in its current like fallen leaves in a river. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who was a philosopher, put it like this:
Time is like a river made up of the events which happen, and its current is strong. No sooner does anything appear than it's swept away, and another comes in its place, and will be swept away too.
That picture of a flow became even starker with the invention of the hourglass, with time linked to the downward flow of little pieces of sand that were continually slipping away. The feeling of loss intensified with the invention of the mechanical clock. Its steady ticking time up into little pieces, each one here for a brief moment. For Shakespeare, it was like the waves of the sea coming in.
Like as the waves make towards the pebbled shore, so do our minutes hasten to their end, each changing place with that which goes before. In sequent toil all forwards do contend.
And he has a terrible inevitability in Macbeth.
Tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day, to the last syllable of recorded time.
The feeling of loss is there in other poets of the time, such as Andrew Marvell.
But at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near, and yonder all before us lie deserts of vast eternity.
And back in the 14th century, we find the Italian poet Petrarch reflecting what stands out about each day of his life, whether it's been spent in business or pleasure.
Alas, this day is irretrievably gone.
Our life, he says, moved on like a ship.
There's no going back or taking pause. We move forward through all tempest and whatever wind. Whether the course be easy or difficult, short or long, through all there is one constant velocity.
Those mountainous waves, rising up one by one ahead of Tony Chisholm's trawlers, slowly making its way through a roaring gale, those waves have a long history through Western civilization. They are part of the picture of time as a river, carrying us along with it. And the events of the Dark of Summer about treachery and its consequences for those who commit it, but also for those who uncover it, depict the influence that flows from events in the past and onward into the future. The burden of the past keeps building through the book. The mission to Faroe provides evidence that leads on to Shetland to confront a man, Mungo Wishart, suspected of betrayal. The evidence is so clear that he cannot live with his guilt. And Tony Chisholm feels his own guilt with consequences for the rest of the Wishart family who had welcomed him into their home. The children, a boy and a girl, had rather adopted him when he came ashore looking lost and sick after a storm at sea. Then, a few years on, amidst the intensity of battle in Korea, he meets a fine young rifleman and discovers that this is the son, Olaf Wishart, child no more, a volunteer for active service. He wonders why Olaf should have wanted to take part in such a war, and soon feels very close to him, with a feeling of replacing the father for whose loss he was responsible. But then comes a terrible battle when they are both wounded and gathered up on top of a big Centurion tank which fights its way towards safety. It soon becomes clear that this will be too late for Olaf. And now comes a scene in which Eric Linklater must have poured a heart full of first-hand experience.
The hard stammer of machine gun fire, reverberating through the steel hull, beat intolerably on our ears. There was now another tank to the left, and between the tanks a group of walking wounded. The Chinese were attacking us, throwing grenades that fell short, and then, as the attack was beaten off, there was a spell of comparative quietness. Olaf opened his eyes and looked at me with intense gravity, but without, as I thought, anxiety. I bent low above him to hear what he was saying, and slowly and very faintly he said, "Do you think this will make up for him?" I had no idea what he meant. But he wanted acquiescence, and I cried, "Yes, yes, of course it will." I saw a change of expression on his bloodless face. It was small enough, but it gave him a look of peace. He whispered again, but I could not hear all he said. It was a message for his mother, and I promised to deliver it. Then he sighed deeply, and was dead, I think, soon afterwards. But I do not know, for I was by then in great pain from my own wound.
And so Tony Chisholm goes back to Shetland to see Olaf's mother and his sister Gudrun, and returns the following year. But by now his mind is so full of the turbulent chain of events of which he has been part, that the past seems to be an impossible burden. He goes fishing with Gudrun and with a Shetlander called Willie Harkus, who tells him about the life of the salmon and their journey upstream. Spawn.
"They are very nearly human," he said. "They have an impulse to breed that won't be denied, and an instinct for dirt that makes a nonsense of all their education in the good, clean sea. They are as stubborn as children and wild as drunkards. They will do anything to get their own way, and what does that amount to? They go swimming upstream, always upstream, mile after mile upstream, to no better end than wriggling in a mire of peat. They're as bad as human beings, but if you cook them properly, they will not taste as bad."
And Tony Chisholm is by now finding out more about his own self. And amidst the flow of the water and the movement of the fish, he is somehow beginning to move forward out of the constrictions of the past, toward freeing himself from his burden of guilt. Then, in his sleep, he dreams of fish and a river.
I was swimming upstream with earnest endeavour against every sort of difficulty to reach at last a dark and perfect happiness, which I knew lay hidden in a secret channel under cover of the heather. That was my whole intention, and I was vastly disconcerted when the narrowing stream became a current in the sky. I was no longer safe and snug between enclosing banks, but all at large in the upper air, and my goal was no longer darkness, but a very bright and distant star. But head to stream I went on swimming, for the compulsion was still strong.
And in his dream of swimming, he lands on a sandbank where a group of choir boys are singing a well-known hymn. Time, like an ever-rolling stream, bears all his sons away.
Angrily, I told them to be quiet. You're out of tune, I said, and I'm pretty sure you don't know your geography. This stream that you're singing about, can you tell me its source? Can you tell me where it rises and where it flows? In the book of Genesis, said one of the boys. It is where it rises, in the far backward and forgotten sump of our beginning, and it flows inexorably towards our unimaginable end. What nonsense, I said crossly. It rises in the future. It flows from the future. And we have to swim upstream. Has anyone heard of Mungo Wishart? We knew him well, said a choir boy with a sad and sinister face. He used to quote Wordsworth to us. Not in entire forgetfulness, and not in utter dark nakedness, but trailing clouds of foul and noxious memory we come. Only if you swim downstream, I said. If you swim upstream, as Willie Harker says you must, though Willie Harker is wrong in thinking you swim into darkness, then your trailing clouds of memory are carried away and you're rid of them. The sandbank dissolved. The choir boys disappeared, and I continued to swim. But now I was swimming easily, in the rhythm of my breathing. I swam out of the dreams into a sound sleep, and did not wake till the red landing light went on. I woke, however, with the memory of my dream whole and fresh in my mind.
Now awake, he reflects on the image in the dream.
In the common way, the traditional way, I have always thought of time as a stream, and I still do. But I no longer think of it as a stream flowing from the past. In my dream, it ran the other way. And the more I ponder my dream, the more I am convinced of its essential truth. Now I see time as a river rising in the future, and like, but contrary to, the lordly fish that swim from the light of the sea to the darkness of their spawning grounds, we may swim upstream from darkness towards the light of its undiscovered source. No compulsion leads us by the nose, but free will permits the choice. In a progress upstream, moreover, memory is not inseparable. Memories gather about us, but against the current, memory can be let go, and the stream will carry it away. Mungo Wishart, of whose unhappiness I often thought, was right when he said, there was no contentment for a man who remembered everything, for a nation that could forget nothing, and the obvious reason is that such a man and such a nation have no faith in the future. They go with the stream and their memories cling to them. They swim in a jelly of unhappiness. But the upstream swimmer and the spawning fish can shed their yesterdays.
And in the months that follow, this new perspective settles into his mind.
I grew accustomed to the idea of living in a vast, invisible, implacable Mississippi of the sky that ran through galaxies of stars from a fountain in the unpredictable future, either of time or space. And as I grew accustomed to the thought, the use of custom let me accept it without the labour of conscious decision.
And this is how he now sees his path ahead, how to shed the burden of the past.
I had to declare my faith in the future, in the light that was our goal, and become an upstream swimmer. Then I could rid myself of guilt and go free.
This image of time flowing from the future is totally remarkable. It's still seen as a river, but now, instead of being carried in its current, we are swimming upstream, facing its full force and making our way against it, fencing our way like the salmon, with every moment fresh and alive and new. It comes the glimpse of light on the horizon as we look at the long, dark chain of wars through the 20th century, with no one seemingly able to deflect us from the course of events and their consequences. Eric Linklater lived through those times, and like so many others, felt himself caught up in a fateful flow.
The stream swimmer and the spawning fish can shed their yesterdays.
And that is an image of hope indeed. But how, you might ask, can anyone challenge an image of time that is so much a part of science? For this, we need to look closer at how that image developed, back the dawn of modern science 4 centuries ago. Sir Isaac Newton simplified the old image of a river to a single line on a graph, measured out into standardized pieces like the ticking from a clock. We continue that image today with the timeline running horizontally in graphs with equal spacing. Newton described motion through equations, and it turns out that these equations do not depend on the direction of time. In practice, it means that if you film some simple motion and then run the film backwards, what you see is also physically possible. So when we film, for instance, billiard balls moving around a table and colliding and rebounding, both directions of events can be physically possible. But when we move to snooker, the differences can be more apparent, and particularly at the start of a game when the snooker balls are placed in a triangle, which we hit with the cue ball and scatter them over the table. Reversing the film shows the various balls around the table appearing to converge into a neat triangle, which we know, of course, is impossible. And generally, when we move from objects patterns, we find that changes often can't be reversed. When we stir sugar into a cup of tea or break an egg, the structure of the sugar or the egg is lost and we can't bring it back. Robert Burns expressed this in the story of Tam O'Shanter, who joyfully sits in a warm, hospitable inn where he could happily stay much longer.
But pleasures are like poppies spread. You seize the flower, its bloom is shed. Or like the snow falls in the river, a moment white, then melts forever. Or like the borealis race that flit ere you can point their place. Or like the rainbow's lovely form, ere vanishing amid the storm, ne man can tether time or tide.
And in the century after Burns, this breakdown of order was brought to the fore in physics through a quantity called entropy, which was simply a measure of disorder. It became linked with heat, as when we warm and melt a solid substance like ice, we destroy the neat crystalline order of its molecules. If we add more heat, the water becomes steam with its molecules flying around freely. So, an increase of disorder could be linked to an increase of heat energy, and gradually there emerged the science of thermodynamics that helped the development of the engines that powered Victorian Britain. At the heart of the new science was this concept of entropy or disorder, and it's given a special position by the second law of thermodynamics, which says that overall, when everything is added up, the total amount of entropy in the universe is always increasing. So if we're shown a film of the images in Robert Burns's mind for Tam O'Shanter, we just need to check if the snow is falling on the river and melting. Disorder or entropy was said to provide an arrow of time. It was a bleak picture with order always breaking down in the long run, but only told half the story. It looked at how easily we can destroy a poppy's bloom, but not at how the bloom and the poppy itself came about to begin with. And indeed, the miracle of the universe is the immense amount of order and structure that it contains, and especially so in living creatures. This order was the starting point for Greek philosophy. The original Greek term cosmos came from a word used for arranging troops for battle. A cosmos was also regarded as a beautiful arrangement, and indeed the word was later used to create our own English word, cosmetic. So the course on which the Greeks set us was to tackle the big fundamental question of where the wonderful and beautiful order came from. In the 20th century, a picture developed of an expanding universe, seeming to emerge from a colossal explosion, later christened the Big Bang. From the resulting debris, there gradually developed stars and planets and living creatures in an ever-increasing amount of order and complexity. But this means, in terms of the second law of thermodynamics and the increasing disorder it requires, that the universe as a whole is somehow going the wrong way. And indeed, life itself seems to be part of the story, as living things are continually building up order within and around them. Just as the universe developed out of the debris of the Big Bang, so do living creatures turn scraps of material into the immensely complex structure of their own cells. An egg may break and add to the entropy and disorder of the world. But if we put it in the soil, then bacteria will eat it and transform it into food for plants, and a hen can eat the seeds and produce a new egg. So living systems can be a source of order. During the Second World War, several people reflected on this. Among them was Erwin Schrödinger, one of the founders of quantum theory, who, in a lecture in 1943, spoke of what he called an organism's astonishing gift of concentrating a stream of order on itself and thus escaping the decay into atomic chaos, of drinking orderliness from a suitable environment. Schrödinger called this quality negative entropy. And although he didn't know it, an Italian mathematician, Luigi Fantapié, had a year before gone further and suggested that entropy or disorder was complemented by something else that created order, something expressed by living systems. Fantapié gave it the name of syntropy.
I have no doubt about the date when I discovered the law of syntropy. It was in the days just before Christmas in 1941, as a consequence of conversations with two colleagues, a physicist and a biologist, that I was suddenly projected in a new panorama which radically changed the vision of science and of the universe, which I had inherited from my teachers, and which I'd always considered the strong and certain ground on which to base my scientific investigations.
Fantapié had started from wave equations, which are widely found in physics, but always have two solutions. One solution radiates outwards, and it's very familiar, as this is what happens when we drop a stone in a pond and see the ripples diverge outward. or when we switch on a lamp and the light radiates. If we were to run a film backwards, we would observe the pond ripples converging on a central point, or the lamp absorbing light, which of course is not something that we see in daily life. But the structure of the wave equation allows for it. And so we have the option of choosing between a wave that goes forward in time and a wave that goes backward in time. Physicists choose the familiar one moving forward in time. But suppose, said Fantapié, suppose that we keep both of them and see what happens. The outward wave that diverges is associated with a breakdown of order, and the inward wave is associated with the creation of order. So, he said, could there be two complementary forces, syntropy and entropy, and each associated with a kind of flow, with entropy from the past and syntropy from the future? And could it be, he asked, that syntropy is the essence of life itself? These are the kind of big questions that syntropy can tackle, although it has yet to get into the mainstream of science. But two-way time with a flow from the future has been emerging in quantum theory, and particularly through the American physicist John Cramer. When two particles interact, he says, there are signals going between them, going backwards and forwards in time at a deep level. There seem to be two deep flows of time, one from the past and the other from the future, and they meet like tidal currents rising up in broken water. So two-way time is really an idea that opens up fresh perspectives at the frontiers of physics. And so the extraordinary thing about the image of time in the dark of summer is that it not only gives an image of hope that looks to be as much needed in the world today as it was in 1956, and that would be a big enough achievement in its own right. But it also expresses a concept that has potential for tackling deep fundamental issues in physics and biology. And that leads to one final question. How could such an idea have come about? One very tentative thought comes from what the narrator of the book, Tony Chisholm, says about being, in his words, very much a man of my own times, and again, a product of my own time and a world in chaos. Eric Linklater's life was shaped in part by war, at times intensively so. Indeed, Erwin Schrödinger was in a similar situation, serving in the Austro-Hungarian artillery in the First World War on the Italian front. This was the winter war that was fought amongst ice and snow in the mountains above the river Socha that the Italians called the Isonzo. Schrödinger fought in several of the battles, sometimes coming under heavy fire. He went through hard times in post-war Austria, and then, almost out of the blue, a midwinter visit to a Swiss mountain resort led to the breakthrough that created the wave model of quantum theory. Maybe it can sometimes take a catastrophic breakup of the familiar pattern of life to shake thinking out of existing patterns and open the way to fresh ideas. And indeed, some of Eric Linklater's other books are characterized by piercing insights that go to the heart of an issue. For instance, his histories, which build pictures of people and events with a vividness that makes the reader feel very close to them. One aspect of his 1937 novel, Juan in China, could even be said to have anticipated the future. Its plot was centered on a search for a secret plan, which turned out to be simply a series of sayings in the style of Confucius, with the wonderfully worthy title, Precepts for the Individual and Good Counsel for the Government. He was much amused in the 1960s when the Little Red Book of Chairman Mao was published. There are also times in his writing when he seems to step effortlessly from our world into another one nearby. There are so many hauntingly beautiful examples, and here's just one. It's from his 1935 short story, The Dancer, in which a family go across to Einhallow to enjoy the midsummer solstice. Well, that's the time of year indeed when the dark of summer was set in Shetland. And in the story of the dancers, Pomfret family take gramophone with them to Einhallow, and they wind up the handle and put on a record and start to dance to see what patterns the music may lead them into.
And then, as the music went on, they found that they were dancing in the proper patterns, for they had partners who had come from nowhere, who led them first to the right and then to the left, to the middle and down the sides, bowing and knocking their heels in the air. As the tune quickened, they turned themselves head over heels, even Mrs. Pomfret, who held her sides and laughed to see old Pomfret twirling on one toe. And the gramophone never stopped, for a little brown man was sitting by it now and then, turning the handle and singing loudly as he sat. So they danced, while the sky became lighter and turned from grey to a shining colour like mackerel. And then little clouds like roses were thrown up over the silver, and at last the sun himself, daffodil gold, all bright and new, shot up and sent the other colours flicking. And everybody shouted and cheered like mad, and for a minute danced more wildly than ever, turning Catherine wheels faster and faster in a circle, or shouting hey and ho and ahoy, ahoy, ahoy. Then they sank to the ground exhausted, and the Pomfrets looked at their partners who had come from nowhere and were suddenly amazed. Well, I'm damned, said old Pomfret, and the little brown men rolled on the grass and laughed as though they would burst.
Someone who could write a story of so much delight and travel between the worlds so naturally is so well placed to take us on one of the greatest journeys possible, to go into the river of time and head upstream in a book to be read and savoured and read again.
Now I see time as a river rising in the future, and like, but contrary to, the lordly fish that swim from the light of the sea to the darkness of their spawning grounds. We may swim upstream from darkness towards the light of its undiscovered source.